He didn't look that strange. In fact, he had a pleasant face with a nice smile, and it was obvious that he worked out regularly. But it was impossible to get past the blue spandex suit, the red cape, and of course the big S on his chest. For at least the 10th time, I quietly cursed my editor for assigning me to write a psycho story. A couple of days ago, she called me into her office. "Have you heard about the guy running around town in the Superman suit?" she asked me. "No," I replied. "Sounds like a psycho to me." "Quite possibly," she admitted. "But the geniuses in the city department think there might be a story in this, and they want us to get it." We tracked him down, and he agreed to an interview. "Guess who'll take it?" she said reproachfully. "Why do I always get the weird people?" I asked, raising my eyes to the sky. But I got the assignment anyway. Whoops! It all flashed through my mind as I got up to meet him. I could only hope it wouldn't be that bad. "I'm Kaylee Finn," I said, rising to shake his hand. "Jake Stevenson," he said, returning my handshake. "Nice to meet you." We sat down, and I pulled out a tape recorder. "I'll be recording today's interview," I said. "Is that okay?" "Sure," he agreed easily. "No problem." I checked the microphone again to make sure it was on. "So, this is Kaylee Finn, a reporter for the New York Times, interviewing Jake Stevenson, aka Superman. Mr. Stevenson, let's get right to the point. Do you really believe you are the Man of Steel?" "I wish you'd call me Jake," he replied. "It would make things a lot friendlier." He smiled lightly, and I nodded in agreement. "Anyway, to answer your question, I'll say that no, I'm far from a superhero. So why are you wearing a suit?" I asked. His face took on a serious expression. "Probably because I didn't want to be vulnerable anymore." I tried not to react, but it wasn't what I expected. "It sounds like someone hurt you badly," I said cautiously. "Do you want to tell me about it?" He sighed slightly. "Okay," he said, and began to tell his story. The F train had that peculiar smell of dampness that you sometimes get in the summer, and I was glad when I finally reached my stop on Queens Boulevard. But once I descended the stairs into the relentless sunshine at street level, I almost wished I was back underground. By the time I reached our apartment, I was dying to get inside, under the air conditioning. Glenda usually got home before I did, but when I unlocked the door, the apartment was dark and quiet. After I cooled down and changed into shorts and a t-shirt, I went into the kitchen and started cooking dinner. When I heard the front door open, I called out to her. "Hey, baby, I'm in the kitchen. It's so hot, I thought it would be nice to make a salad for dinner. Do you mind?" She poked her head out from behind the door frame. "Before you do that, would you mind coming out and talking to me?" "Sure," I said and washed my hands, then walked into the combined living dining room. Glenda was sitting on the couch with her arms folded and her legs tucked up as if she was freezing. Seeing the look on her face, I asked, "Everything okay, baby?" She raised her head but didn't look me in the eye as I lowered myself into the chair. "God," she said, "this is harder than I thought." Now I was concerned. "What's the matter, Glenda? What's wrong?" She took a deep breath, then exhaled sharply. "I don't know any other way to do this, Jake, so I'm going to be blunt. I want a divorce." "What?" I asked stupidly. "Is this a joke or something?" "No," she said quietly. "I'm not kidding. I'm going to file for divorce." I felt like I was in one of the bad novels I have to edit at work, except the characters usually have witty countermoves. I, on the other hand, had none. "But why? We have a good marriage. I don't want to get divorced. I love you." She shook her head impatiently, as if I were a child slowly learning lessons. "No, things haven't been this good for a long time. I could feel it, even if you didn't." She shifted on the couch and leaned forward, almost as if trying to convince me of something. "You didn't do anything, Jake. We just drifted apart. It's no one's fault. It just happens sometimes." I tried to protest, but she held up her hand. "Please don't," she said. "There's nothing you can say to make me change my mind. I'll just pack my things and leave," she continued. I was still in a state of bewilderment. "You're leaving? Where are you going? Can't we talk about this?" She shook her head sadly. "I'm going to stay at a friend's house until we get things formalized here. Please just accept it. Neither of us wants to say anything that will make the situation any harder than it already is." With those words, she disappeared into our bedroom, and while I stood there in shock, she reappeared a surprisingly short time later, rolling her suitcase behind her. It was as if she'd already packed it, and was just waiting for the right moment. Please, Glenda, how about counseling? Can't we find someone? She stepped around me and opened the door. I'm sorry, Jake. I don't have anything to talk about. It has to be like this. With those words, she rolled her bag across the threshold and slammed the door behind her, leaving me standing in stunned silence. I slowly walked over to the couch and collapsed onto it. In the novels I edit, the protagonist goes into a rage, heads to the nearest bar to get drunk, or leaves to try to get laid. I didn't do any of those things. Instead, I sat in the encroaching darkness, trying to find answers to the questions swarming in my head. I just couldn't understand what had happened, much less why. My relationship with Glenda wasn't anything extraordinary, but it wasn't bad either. We went to the same college and were part of a group that hung out together all 4 years we were there. Most of the time, neither of us dated much. It was easier to do things as a group rather than as a couple. But in our senior year, Glenda started dating a guy who wasn't in our group, so we didn't see her as much as we used to. I think she was hoping he would propose, but he chose grad school in California, and they broke up at graduation. I was an English major, and like many others, wanted to go into publishing after graduation. So like many others, I moved to New York City and started looking for a job. 500 resumes and 40 interviews later, I was working as a waiter and living with 5 friends in a 1-bedroom apartment in a bad neighborhood in Brooklyn. And then I got lucky. It turned out that my grandfather knew someone in the publishing business, and when he heard about my dreams, he approached me with a request. Eventually, I was able to land an internship with a real publishing company. The bad news was that the internship only paid minimum wage, so I still had to moonlight at night after I was released from my day job. The good news was that now I was actually working in the industry I aspired to and had the opportunity to learn what publishing was like from the inside. Now I was working 2 jobs and making 1 paltry salary, including tips. But the wonderful thing about being young is that you have both the energy and naivete to tolerate those conditions longer than anyone not in true slavery. On a Tuesday night, when I didn't have restaurant work, my roommates and I decided to head to a bar in Midtown Manhattan and spend some of our precious income on overpriced alcohol. While we were chatting raucously, I looked up and saw none other than Glenda Preston and her 2 girlfriends enter the bar. He stopped his narrative abruptly. "Can you not mention her name?" he asked. "Why?" I asked curiously. He looked at me a little embarrassed. I guess I'm still trying to make sense of it all. Somehow it seems like open warfare with her isn't going to help. I was surprised. It seems my psycho was deeper than I had realized. "Actually, it'll make it easier for me," I told him. "I won't have to track her down and find out her side of the story. What's more, this should be about Superman, not his ex-wife." All right, he said, and continued his story. Spotting her, I nearly knocked the beer bottle out of my roommate's hands as I rushed toward her. But as I approached her little cove, I stopped, suddenly hesitating. Would she be as glad to see me as I was to see her? But at that moment, she looked up and, spotting me, squealed, "Jake!" and rushed to hug me. We hugged, then she pulled away, looked at me carefully, and kissed me on the lips. I didn't understand where it came from, but I felt fine, so I didn't care. She put her arm around my waist and introduced me to her girlfriends. I, in turn, dragged them to meet my roommates, thus earning countless brownie points, since neither of us was that comfortable trying to pick up a girl. Glenda and I had a great time that night. It was like being back in college. Much later than I'd planned, we finally broke up for the night, but we had already exchanged phone numbers and promised to keep in touch. That's how it all began. I called her the next day, and we started hanging out again, this time more as a couple. Within a few months, we were officially dating, and before long, we moved in together. Everything seemed perfect. We got married a year later and settled into a routine. Life was good, or so I thought. I had no idea that Glenda was unhappy. Looking back, I suppose there were signs, little things I missed. She started staying out late, claiming it was work-related. She seemed distant, and we argued more. But I never imagined it would come to this. I never thought she would leave me. He stopped talking and looked down at his hands, which were clenched tightly in his lap. I waited for him to continue, but he didn't. Finally, I spoke. That sounds incredibly tough, Jake. I'm sorry you went through that. But what does this have to do with the Superman suit? He looked up at me, a small, sad smile playing on his lips. I guess I needed a way to cope, to feel strong when I felt like everything in my life was falling apart. Wearing the suit made me feel like I could handle anything, like I wasn't as vulnerable as I felt inside. It was my armor, my way of dealing with the pain. I nodded, understanding now. So it's not about being a superhero, it's about finding strength in the face of adversity. Exactly, he said. I'm not Superman, but wearing the suit helps me feel like I can be. As I wrapped up the interview and thanked Jake for his time, I couldn't help but feel a deep sense of empathy for him. He wasn't crazy. He was just a man trying to find his way through the darkness, using whatever means he could to feel a little bit stronger. And in that moment, I realized that we all have our own ways of dealing with life's challenges. Some of us just wear our armor on the inside, while others, like Jake, choose to wear it on the outside. And after exchanging phone numbers, she gave me another kiss full of promise. We started meeting every chance we got. The only difference this time was that there was no group to distract us or smooth our interactions, and so the relationship seemed to move faster and burn hotter than I think either of us expected. One of the realities of living in poverty is how hard it is to find time and space to be alone together. My apartment was a disaster. One or more of my roommates would always show up out of nowhere, usually at the most inopportune moment. Even when I had pre-planned and reserved one of the two bedrooms for a few hours, someone would walk in unexpectedly, oblivious to our desire for privacy. Glenda's was a little better, because there were only 4 roommates, and they were all girls who understood and followed the rules of social etiquette much more scrupulously. Still, their apartment was tiny, and the interior walls were thin, so there was no real privacy, especially when we were in the throes of passion. Hearing giggles coming through the door was unpleasant enough, and hearing the constant comments on our liaison was just too much. Despite all the obstacles, our relationship continued to grow, and we talked about finding a place just for the two of us. But the realities of New York real estate and entry-level salaries made that just another rosy pipe dream, until fate intervened again. Out of the blue, there was a shakeup at the publishing house, and a vacancy for a junior editor opened up. I must have made a good impression because I was offered the job. The pay was about as much as I could make in a month as a waiter, but there were employee benefits, so I didn't hesitate to turn in my waiter's uniform and become a real book editor. No sooner had we celebrated my good fortune than Glenda was equally fortunate. She was moonlighting at Dennison and Lozer, one of the many large law firms in town, and when a paralegal position became available, they hired Glenda full-time. She was low on the totem pole, too, but law firms paid more than publishing houses, and her starting salary was higher than mine. Moreover, when we added up our salaries, we realized that we had enough money to make our dream come true. After much searching, we found a small apartment on the 6th floor of an old building in Forest Hills. The only reason we could afford it was because the building was almost a mile from the nearest subway station. We rented it right away. After that, we went shopping for used furniture, and on moving day, I got down on one knee and presented Glenda with the ring my parents' loan allowed me to buy. From the look on Glenda's face, you would have thought it was the Hope Diamond. The first few years of our marriage were good. Although our funds were extremely limited, we found ways to enjoy the Big Apple and each other. Because we were so far from Brooklyn, I lost touch with my old roommates, but made new friends among the other junior editors at the publisher. Soon a small group of us would get together for lunch or happy hour, and it was a lot like my old college gang. Glenda kept in touch with her roommates, but didn't seem to make that many friends at the law firm, probably because it was pretty stuffy, at least as far as I could tell. But if her job wasn't a source of social opportunity, it was definitely rewarding from a career standpoint. Glenda showed a real aptitude for legal matters, and her talent was recognized and rewarded. She began to be given more challenging assignments, which she enjoyed doing, and upon successful performance, she was promoted and moved to a higher partner in the firm. This inevitably led to longer working hours, but she was happy for the opportunity to show what she could do, and I was happy for her. And that brought me back to tonight and Glenda's sudden, incomprehensible departure. I went to the refrigerator, pulled out a six-pack of beer, and returned to the couch to try to figure out what had happened. I hadn't expected this turn of events. Sure, we no longer had that feeling of first love where I couldn't bear to tear myself away from you for a minute, but no one stays that way forever. Sure, our jobs have kept us apart more and more lately, but isn't that the price you have to pay to succeed? What drove me crazy was that we had no major fights, no clash of goals or values, nothing that could explain her decision. Okay, I'll admit that there were times when she was intolerant of our standard of living, but I felt the same way. And anyway, weren't we on a path that would eventually lead us to more of the things we wanted? Glenda was already moving in that direction. And once one of the seniors, that's what we called the senior editors at my company, finally decided to retire, I'd be in line for a nice promotion too. So what was the problem? The more I recounted the events and the longer I drank, the more chaotic my emotions became. I became despondent at the thought of my marriage falling apart. I loved Glenda, and it hurt like hell to find out that she no longer loved me. What was I supposed to tell my parents? They loved Glenda too, and were looking forward to having grandchildren. The thought infuriated me. How could she be so impulsive and selfish? Did she not realize how many people she was hurting, starting with me? The pain, the confusion, and the anger swirled around in my mind, each emotion feeding off the other, creating a storm that threatened to overwhelm me. I finished the six-pack, but the answers I sought didn't come. The only thing I felt was the deepening sense of loss and the creeping numbness that the alcohol provided. The room grew darker as night fell, but I couldn't muster the energy to turn on the lights. Instead, I sat in the gloom, my mind replaying every moment of our time together, searching for clues, for signs that I had missed. I felt like a detective on a case, but the more I searched, the more elusive the truth became. Finally, exhaustion took over, and I fell into a restless sleep right there on the couch. My dreams were filled with fragmented images of Glenda, our life together, and the inexplicable void that had suddenly consumed it all. When I woke up the next morning, my head was pounding, and the reality of my situation hit me like a ton of bricks. Glenda was gone, and I was left to pick up the pieces. Over the next few days, I went through the motions of my life in a daze. I went to work, interacted with my colleagues, and tried to keep up appearances, but inside, I was a wreck. The pain of Glenda's departure was like a constant ache that I couldn't escape. Every corner of our apartment was a reminder of her, of what we had shared, and of what I had lost. It was unbearable. In a desperate attempt to cope, I threw myself into my work, taking on extra assignments and staying late at the office. But no matter how busy I kept myself, the emptiness remained. I avoided going home until I was so exhausted that I could collapse into bed without thinking. I stopped seeing friends, stopped going out, and became a ghost of my former self. Then one day, while aimlessly browsing the internet, I stumbled across a forum for people dealing with heartbreak. It was filled with stories of others who had gone through similar experiences, and for the first time, I didn't feel so alone. I started reading the posts, immersing myself in the shared pain and struggles of strangers. It was comforting to know that I wasn't the only one suffering. One post in particular caught my eye. It was written by a guy who had gone through a devastating breakup and had found solace in an unexpected way. He had started dressing up as a superhero, specifically Superman, and it had helped him feel stronger and more in control of his life. At first, I thought it was ridiculous, but the more I read, the more intrigued I became. There was something about the idea of adopting an alter ego, of stepping into a role that represented strength and resilience, that resonated with me. In a moment of impulsiveness, I ordered a Superman costume online. When it arrived, I felt a mix of excitement and apprehension. I put it on, and as I looked at myself in the mirror, I couldn't help but feel a surge of confidence. It was as if the costume was a shield, a way to protect myself from the pain and vulnerability that had consumed me. I started wearing it around the apartment, and gradually, I began to feel a little bit stronger each day. Eventually, I took the costume outside. At first, it was just short walks around the neighborhood, but then I started going to parks and even downtown. People would look at me, some would laugh, others would give me strange looks, but I didn't care. Wearing the suit made me feel invincible, like I could handle anything that came my way. And that's how I became known as the guy in the Superman suit. It wasn't about being a superhero, it was about finding a way to cope, to heal, and to reclaim a sense of control over my life. It was my way of dealing with the pain and turning it into something positive. And in a strange way, it worked. This, of course, made me sink into an even deeper depression about her inexplicable departure. I staggered back to the bedroom and collapsed onto our double bed, not bothering to undress. Fuck it, I thought drunkenly. It doesn't matter anyway. The problem with beer is that it creates an undeniable need for relief, so strong that it woke me up early in the morning and sent me stumbling to the bathroom. I barely made it, and the process was so excruciating that I nearly screamed. When I finally finished, I found myself fully awake. My stomach felt like it had been filled with battery acid, and at the same time, I felt like I hadn't eaten in a day, which I realized was almost true. Swearing under my breath, I surrendered to the inevitable, got up, showered, and shaved. Then I headed towards the subway station, stopping by a small coffee shop to get breakfast. There was only one other customer there at that hour. Likewise, when I got to the office, I was the first person there. I tried to immerse myself in my work, but my thoughts kept drifting back to what had happened. Not knowing why she'd left kept gnawing at me, and as time went on, I grew angrier and angrier. I finally convinced myself that I deserved answers, and I decided to act. Glenda and I never visited each other during work hours. Our business was sacred, not to be disturbed. Today was an exception. I knew when Glenda usually went to lunch, and I carefully timed my visit so that I would arrive just before she left. I even splurged on a cab to her office to make sure I wouldn't be late. When I walked into the Dennison and Lawser law office, I didn't recognize the receptionist, but since I had met very few people there, that didn't surprise me. "Hi," I said. "I'm Jake Stevenson, Glenda Preston's husband. I've come to ask her to lunch." The receptionist looked up at me with astonished eyes. "Okay, I'll just call her and let her know you're here." No, I said hastily. "It's a surprise. I'll just go back and get her." She looked at me doubtfully, but I walked confidently past the counter to the front door, and she obediently let me pass through. As I walked through the aisles, I thought I noticed a few curious looks, but I ignored them and headed straight for Glenda's cubicle. She was chatting with another young woman, but when she saw me, she stopped abruptly, and her face went pale. "What are you doing here, Jake?" she demanded. "You can't be here. I'm working." "Well, I'm here," I said belligerently. "And I intend to stay until you tell me why you left me last night." "Keep your voice down," she hissed at me, her face turning bright red. "I explained to you last night why I was leaving." I was getting more and more angry. "You didn't explain anything. You just told me a bunch of platitudes that don't mean anything." She looked around, and I realized that we had attracted a small crowd. Other people working in the area clustered around her in a semicircle, as if to help her fend off an attack. I was embarrassed, but I couldn't back down. Realizing that a confrontation could not be avoided, Glenda seemed to jump at the opportunity. "You want to know why I left you?" she said, making no attempt to lower her voice. "Well, I'll tell you. I'm leaving you because you're a nobody. You're a weak little man hanging on to your pathetic job, hoping that someday someone will die and you'll get a promotion. You're boring and uninteresting. You've gotten fat and sloppy. That's why I'm leaving you." I stood there in shock, my mouth agape. I felt like I had been punched in the face. Who was that woman? "But," I objected weakly, "you didn't say anything before." "Well, I just did, loser," she snapped back. "And you want to know something else? You suck in bed, and not in a good way." "Ooh, great," I heard someone exclaim in the crowd. I was stunned, my pride wounded. "Well, screw you," I said firmly. She only laughed. "Screw you? You work for a publishing company, and screw you is the best you can do? That's just pathetic." "Ouch, that's gotta hurt," came another voice from behind, and the whole group burst into laughter. Humiliated, I glared at her, then turned and walked out, the laughter following me. When I walked through the door into the reception area, the receptionist looked up in surprise. "Aren't you going to lunch with Glenda?" she asked. "No," I replied curtly. "Oh," she said and smiled broadly. "Well, have a good day." Luckily, the elevator door opened at that moment, and I rushed inside in time to escape. There was no hope of me getting any work done after all that, so I called the office and told them that something I had eaten didn't agree with me. Then, I got on the subway at Queen Station and headed home. After changing into jeans and a t-shirt, I went downstairs and went for a walk to Flushing Meadows and the Old World's Fair site. I found a place to sit near the Unisphere, and as I looked at the huge metal sculpture of the globe, I wondered what had just happened to me. My life had turned upside down in the span of 24 hours, and I was left reeling, trying to make sense of the chaos that had suddenly engulfed my world. I'd never heard Glenda complain about any of the things she'd accused me of in her office today. Sure, I was ambitious, but I was also smart enough to realize that opportunities don't come along very often in the publishing business. What's wrong with being patient? And that rant about my sexual activity was a low blow, literally. She never once complained. Besides, I was sure she often had orgasms when we had sex, but if she wasn't satisfied, I'd be happy to do more or try something different if only she'd mentioned it. Nevertheless, I had to admit that her insults shook me to the core. I looked down at myself and noticed an incipient roll of fat around my waist. Damn, I had let myself get sloppy. When I was in college, I kept myself in pretty good shape, but the fat around my middle was something I couldn't deny. Beer and bar food, I thought with guilt. I immediately made a vow to myself: join a gym, give up alcohol. After Glenda's scathing assessment of me today, I was under no illusions that I could win her back, and I didn't want to, for that matter, but I could damn sure show her that I could change if she'd only give me a chance. I pulled out my smartphone and found a gym near my office. It wasn't cheap, but I figured the fact that I could save money on beer would help me get by. I went back to work the next morning, bringing my gym bag with me, and for the next 2 weeks, I went to work out every day after work. My muscles ached, but not as much as my ego, and I'll admit, my heart. Even if Glenda had turned into some kind of harpy, I couldn't fall out of love overnight with the woman who had recently been my wife. The other junior editors beckoned me to join them on their after-work walks, but I dodged them, making one excuse or another to get out of it. I didn't want to tell them I'd given up alcohol. I didn't want them to know I went to the gym every day now, and most of all, I didn't want to admit the reason why. But of course, I was a fool to think I could keep up this facade for long. Anyway, one afternoon I got a call from Candy at the front desk, informing me that I had a visitor. As I walked outside, I saw a man I was sure I had never met before. Nevertheless, he smiled pleasantly at me and asked, "Jake Stevenson?" "Yes," said I curiously. He handed me an envelope. "Mr. Stevenson, you have been served." With those words, he bowed to Candy, turned, and walked away. Candy had already outlived several husbands, so she knew exactly what had happened. Even if she didn't, the look on my face would have been obvious to her. "Oh, Jake, I'm so sorry," she said. "I didn't know you and Glenda were having problems." I nodded at her words and turned to walk back to my desk, not trusting my voice to say anything. Sure, I had expected something like this, but the finality of the divorce decree still made a strong impression on me. The envelope lay unopened on my desk as the clock struck 5 o'clock, and my 3 best friends from work stood in front of me. "Let's go, Jake," Marie said, grabbing my hand. "You're coming with us." I tried to protest, but the 3 of them wouldn't settle down, and I didn't have the strength to resist. When we got to the bar, they all looked at each other when I ordered a soda with lemon, but no one said anything. Finally, Jacob took the bull by the horns. "Okay, Jake, Candy told us about what happened today. Come on, spill it. What happened between you and Glenda?" And I did. I wasn't going to wash my dirty laundry in front of my friends, but it had been festering inside me for so long that once I started, everything came out, even the details of my humiliating meeting with Glenda in her office. "That bitch," Tommy exclaimed, "must have slept with Connor. Ouch!" He turned to Marie with an accusing look. "What did you kick me for?" But I paid no attention to their bickering and grabbed on to what Tommy was saying. Slept with Connor? Are you talking about Connor James from her law firm? What does he have to do with Glenda? I demanded. Well, after we saw him sucking on her face, it was pretty obvious. Ouch! Damn it, Marie, that really hurts. Don't you know when to keep your mouth shut? Marie hissed at Tommy as he stood rubbing his shin. Then she turned to me with an apologetic look on her face. I'm sorry, Jake. Back in March, the three of us went out to dinner, and then we walked into a bar and saw them together. From the way they were acting, it was pretty obvious what was going on. I made a few quick mental calculations. No, it couldn't be her. She took night classes back in March. Oh, yes, Jacob picked up on that. She took night classes. Then he saw the angry look in Marie's eyes and took a quick step back to avoid getting under her foot. Don't any of you ever think before you speak? She asked in frustration. She turned to face me again. Jake, that wasn't the only time. The two of them weren't exactly discreet. Now I was not only angry, but humiliated. You knew, and you didn't tell me? What kind of friends are you? Marie took my hand, trying to calm me down. Come on, Jake, it's not that simple. We didn't know what was really going on, and neither of us wanted to spread rumors. Besides, they were so blatant about it, we thought maybe you knew, and... You thought I knew and didn't mind, I asked in amazement. I can't believe it. I headed for the door, but Jacob grabbed my arm, his grip firm yet gentle. Look, kid, the truth is, if any of us had told you about this, you'd deny everything and start hating us. You know it's true. Everybody shoots the messenger. Deep down, I knew he was right, but that didn't make me feel any better. Being humiliated enough in front of Glenda's coworkers to become a cuckold in front of my friends was beyond me. It was the coup de grace, the ultimate wound. Jake looked up at me, confused but defiant. Anyway, that's when I decided to start wearing the Superman costume. I was so engrossed in his story that I had to shake myself out of my reverie. I'd been dumped before, and it was painful, but Jake's experience must have been much more painful and humiliating. I went back into reporter mode, but I still didn't get it, Jake. How did you go from abandoned husband to Superman costume? He continued his story. I wasn't sure I could handle going back to work, but the next morning I forced myself to go to the gym because exercise seemed like the only way to take my mind off everything else. It didn't work that morning. All I could think about was wanting to hide, become invisible, or turn into someone else. Eventually, I gave up and left. On my way to the office, I passed a bookstore. There were books and posters about superheroes in the window. As a kid, I loved comic books and cartoons and had seen almost every movie about comic book characters. Like all kids, I dreamed of becoming a superhero. Now, in my desperate state of mind, these memories came upon me with renewed vigor. Then I remembered the previous Halloween when I went to a costume party wearing a Batman costume. It was just a cheap mask and costume, but I felt good wearing it and enjoyed the party immensely. But now the superhero I envied was Superman because he couldn't be harmed. After all the pain and humiliation I had endured, the idea of being invulnerable seemed extremely desirable. I guess a lot of things came together in me at the same time. My life was miserable, and I wanted to be someone else. I felt weak and helpless, and I wanted to be strong. Moreover, I felt vulnerable and didn't want to be hurt. I know I probably sound crazy, and to be honest, I really knew that wearing the Superman costume wouldn't make bullets bounce off me. I just wanted to feel like that for a little while, even if it wasn't real. I just felt so awful that I felt like I had to try something, even the craziest thing, to make myself feel better. Anyway, at that moment it felt like the right thing to do, and I did it. When he stopped talking, I decided I needed to change gears. Okay, so how did you get your suit? He brightened. There's a small tailoring shop between my apartment and the subway station. It's run by a wonderful old seamstress named Golda Mermelstein. So on my way home, I stopped by and told her what I needed. She listened silently while I described what I wanted, then took out a tape measure and started taking measurements, as if what I was asking for was a regular thing. Come back in a week, she said in a thick Yiddish accent. That's how I got my suit, he concluded. She did an amazing job. He stood up, turned around so I could admire Mrs. Mermelstein's work, and I realized that my first impression had been correct. Jake was indeed quite trim. The elastic material fit him snugly, and I admired the work for a moment. He coughed politely, and I realized I'd been staring at him for too long. I quickly grabbed my notebook and went through the notes I had prepared. "Why don't you tell me about the first time you put on the suit?" I asked. He sat back down. "The following Saturday, I decided to wear it for the first time. It was the scariest night of my life," he grinned in surprise. "You know, it wasn't easy the first time. I have a newfound respect for women who wear tights. But anyway, when I put them on, it felt pretty nice, kind of like sportswear. Besides, I told myself, it would take forever to get out of them again, so I might as well go for it." As I walked toward the subway, I noticed a few people looking at me, but no one said anything. I guess in New York, they are used to seeing strange people walking down the street. But I noticed that when I went down to the subway platform to wait, all the people around me moved away. The same thing happened when I entered the subway car. No one sat next to me or even looked at me. It was a bizarre kind of freedom, a cloak of invisibility brought about by the sheer audacity of my appearance. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt a glimmer of something that resembled hope. But after a while, I noticed a little girl about 6 years old riding with her mom. She looked at me with wide eyes and suddenly ran up asking, "Are you Superman?" Her mother started to panic, so I kept my hands at my sides and smiled warmly at the girl. "No," I told her gently, "I just like to dress up as Superman sometimes." Before her mother could pull her away, I asked, "Do you like to play dress up?" The girl beamed with pride. "Oh yes, but I like to dress up like a princess." With those words, she raised her arms above her head and twirled like a ballerina. I smiled again and started asking her about being a princess. Her mother watched me carefully, but I noticed that the tension on her face began to ease. I also saw some of the other passengers observing us, and a couple even smiled at our conversation. The girl and I chatted until I reached my stop. I slowly stood up, trying not to make any sudden movements. "I should get going," I said, waving lightly at her. "Bye-bye, princess." She waved back enthusiastically. "Bye-bye, Superman." As I stepped onto the platform, her mother offered a slight smile, and I nodded in appreciation. I felt a warm sense of satisfaction, but I knew the real test awaited me. I decided to challenge myself further by heading to a popular night spot. When I reached the door, I saw the place was packed, and I hesitated. Then I thought, Superman wouldn't be afraid to go in there. He'd walk in like he owned the place. So I pushed the door open and walked in with confidence. As I made my way to the bar, the noise level dropped noticeably, and I could feel people staring at me. The hum of whispered comments and curious glances followed me, but the bartender remained unfazed. "What can I get you?" he asked calmly. "A soda with lime," I replied. He nodded without a hint of surprise. As I sipped my drink, the guy next to me tapped my shoulder. "So, are you doing a movie or something?" he asked. "No," I told him. "I just wanted to try something different." "Okay, cool," he said, turning back to his drink. I felt a wave of relief. Normally, I'm pretty introverted, but I figured if I'd gotten this far, I might as well push a little further. "So you're a fan of the Superman movies?" I asked. Before long, we were chatting about comic book heroes, and others around us joined in. We had a lively discussion about the merits of various action heroes. Eventually, the woman next to me pulled out her cell phone to take a picture, and when I glanced at the time, I was surprised at how late it had gotten. I was having so much fun, I hadn't noticed the hours slipping by. I paid the bartender, leaving a generous tip, and headed for the exit. As I reached the door, someone called out, "Good night, Superman," and a few others joined in. I turned, waved, and swung my cape dramatically to the laughter and cheers of the crowd. Nothing remarkable happened on the subway ride back to Queens, but when I walked into my apartment, I felt so exhilarated that I stayed up late, savoring the positive experience of the night. As I finally got into bed, I realized that for the first time, I had spent an entire evening without thinking about Glenda. After that, I started wearing the suit almost every weekend and in the evenings too. Most people enjoyed seeing me in it, and I found that I didn't feel so vulnerable anymore. It was a great conversation starter. Jake smiled at me, and I couldn't help but smile back. I was happy for him, but I suspected that while his life in the superhero costume had started out well, It might have a darker side yet to be revealed. Okay, I said. I think that's enough for today. I'll want to ask you some more questions later, but we need to go to the park to take some pictures. My editor had arranged for one of our staff photographers to take some shots of Jake in his suit at Central Park. The park offered some great backdrops, and Jake had mentioned that he often went there, so we hoped to capture some interactions with the public. We got into a cab, and the driver couldn't take his eyes off Jake's suit. To my surprise, Jake engaged him in conversation, and soon they were discussing the merits of capes. My father wore a cape in the old country, the driver said, and Jake remarked that they were surprisingly comfortable. I tried not to roll my eyes, but found it endearing when Jake shook the cabbie's hand and wished him well. At the park, the photographer wanted Jake to stand on a granite ledge with the dramatic backdrop of the city skyline. At the right angle, you could see the Dakota Twin Towers rising above the tree line. As Jake struck various poses, people started to gather, some taking photos, others just smiling and waving. "Hey, Superman," a child called out, running up to Jake. He knelt down, smiled, and gave the kid a high five. The crowd loved it, and I realized I was witnessing something special. This wasn't just a man in a costume. This was someone rediscovering himself, one smile and high five at a time. Jake was clearly enjoying himself, moving and posing as directed by the photographer, but looking completely natural and at ease. He truly felt at home in that suit, and I couldn't help but envy his nonchalance. Suddenly, a child's voice called out, "Hey, Superman!" Jake's face lit up with genuine excitement. In an instant, he leaped off the boulder and made his way over to greet a group of half a dozen or so teenage boys, calling some of them by name. Before long, they were all sitting on the grass in a circle around Jake, listening intently as he spun a tale about Superman that I was certain he'd crafted himself. Eventually, a mother's voice called from across the field, and the boys sprang to their feet, laughing and waving goodbye to Jake as they ran off. "Sorry about that," he said, returning to us. "I've met these kids here before, so I couldn't just brush them off. Besides, I really like kids. I'd love to have a couple myself." His face clouded momentarily, and I realized he was thinking about his failed marriage. My heart ached for him, but soon enough, he shook off the melancholy and his bright smile returned. I turned to the photographer. "Did you get everything you needed?" I asked. "Oh, yes," she said enthusiastically. "The poses on the rocks were fantastic, and I got plenty of great shots while he was telling stories to the kids." She looked at me curiously and whispered, "Is this guy for real?" I shook my head. I wish I knew. Walking back to Jake, I said, "You were great with the kids, and it seemed to go well at the bar that night you told me about. But don't people ever laugh at you or make fun of you?" "Oh, sure," he said casually. "Often. But I just wave and smile at them, and they don't bother me." He looked at me with a shrewd expression. I have a way of dealing with things like that. When something unpleasant happens, I ask myself, what would Superman do? For example, if someone started making fun of Superman, it wouldn't bother him one bit. He knows who he is and what he can do, and their remarks bounce off him like bullets. I still had my doubts. But what if people don't want to talk to someone wearing a suit? Don't you think you sometimes push people away? "I guess so," he said thoughtfully. "But if they don't want to deal with me, that's fine. I'm not trying to impose myself on others. I'm just trying to live like everyone else, just doing it differently." He saw my skepticism and suddenly brightened up. "Hey, I have an idea. Are you doing anything tomorrow night?" When I admitted that I had no plans, he got excited. "Instead of another job interview, why don't you come with me? We'll go somewhere, and you can see for yourself what it's like." When I hesitated, he leaned closer, his impatience evident. "Come on, it'll be fun. What have you got to lose?" It was starting to turn into something more than I expected, but I knew what my editor would want me to do, and besides, Jake's enthusiasm was infectious. "Okay, I'll do it," I told him, and he looked genuinely pleased. Back at my apartment that evening, I recounted my strange interview to Ruby, my roommate. She too thought he sounded like another psycho. When I mentioned that I accepted his invitation to go out with him the next night, she only rolled her eyes. "Come on, Kaylee," she said. "Can't you find a normal guy to go out with?" I laughed, but her words stung a bit. I'd had a few bad encounters, and Ruby knew I was intimidated. Of course, Ruby considered herself more my guardian angel than just a roommate, but I appreciated her concern for me. Unsurprisingly, I was a little anxious the next night when the cab dropped me off at the bar where I was supposed to meet Jake. I had no idea what to expect, and the fact that Jake was nowhere to be seen didn't help my nerves. But then I heard my name being called, and I turned around to see Jake in his Superman costume striding down the sidewalk toward me. "It'll be fun," he said with a confident smile, and taking my hand like it was the most natural thing in the world, he led me inside. As soon as we passed through the door, I noticed the tone of the background noise change. People were pointing and talking, and I started to feel very self-conscious. But Jake immediately ducked into the crowd, guiding me behind him to the bar. The bartender noticed Jake and called out loudly, "Superman is in the house." Immediately, the room filled with cheers and applause, and the excitement level seemed to rise. After checking with me, Jake ordered a glass of white wine for me and a soda for himself. As soon as the drinks arrived, he took my hand and led me toward a large gathering of people on one side of the room. As we walked, people kept reaching out to shake his hand or greet him. I was getting more than my share of curious stares, and I began to realize that being with Jake meant being around a small celebrity. Jake joined the conversation like a child jumping into a pool on a hot day. He instantly engaged in discussions with almost anyone within earshot, and I marveled at the ease with which he participated. As I observed, several things caught my eye. First, although he actively engaged in the conversation, he was careful not to dominate it. Instead, he kept asking for other people's opinions, and when he seemed to disagree with them, he would simply turn to someone else and ask for their view. Secondly, he was consistently friendly, smiling at people and giving them positive feedback, making them feel good about themselves. His charm was undeniable, and I could see why people were drawn to him. He had a way of making everyone feel included and valued, which was a rare and admirable quality. As the night went on, I found myself relaxing and even enjoying the attention that came with being Superman's date. Jake's genuine kindness and warmth were infectious, and I started to see why he chose to wear that costume. It wasn't just about feeling invulnerable. It was about bringing a little bit of joy and positivity into the world, one conversation at a time. Finally, even though I was there primarily as a passive observer, Jake made an effort to involve me in the process. His sensitivity and inclusiveness were endearing. He was remarkably easy to communicate with. Another thing I quickly noticed was that Jake never stayed in one spot for long. He moved fluidly through the crowd, chatting with new people as they entered his orbit and then seamlessly transitioning to the next group. It was a completely natural process for him, and I found myself unexpectedly enjoying the evening. I had anticipated being a mere fly on the wall, observing and mentally noting details for my article. Instead, I was engaging in conversations more than I usually did and genuinely having a good time. I also found myself indulging in a few more glasses of white wine, which probably helped to loosen my tongue and encourage even more interaction. As the evening was drawing to a close, a rather striking blonde woman made her way through the throng of people. She approached Jake and, pointing at me, asked in a demanding tone, "Is this your date?" Jake turned to me with a playful smile and asked, "I don't know, Kaylee. Are you my date?" Blushing, I quickly responded, "No, I'm just a friend." "Good," the blonde said, and then, to my shock, she brazenly began caressing the front of Jake's swim trunks. "So why don't you and I go back to my place and find out if you really are a man of steel?" she asked provocatively. Jake turned an even deeper shade of red and quickly removed her hand. "Sorry, but I'm all business tonight." Her face fell in disappointment, but she wasn't ready to give up. "We could do that too, you know." When Jake shook his head with a smile, she huffed, "That's your loss, superhero," and stalked off in her stilettos, clearly displeased. Jake leaned over and spoke quietly into my ear. "Looks like the locals are getting restless," he said with a wry smirk. "Maybe we should call it a night." I was frozen from the intensity of the moment and surprised to find that the blonde's aggressive approach had made me jealous. I was relieved when Jake took my hand and began to lead me towards the door. And then, the situation I had been dreading occurred. A hulking man, clearly drunk, stepped out from the crowd directly into our path. He stared at Jake with a grin that suggested he felt insulted. "So you're the wimp who thinks he's a superhero," he growled, and the crowd around us fell silent. Clinging to Jake, I watched as two other rough-looking men closed ranks behind the giant. I fumbled for my cell phone, ready to dial 911 if things escalated. To his credit, Jake didn't flinch. "I'm the one wearing the Superman costume," he said in a calm, even tone, "but I'm far from a superhero." The big guy squinted at him, his eyes narrowing in a drunken haze. "If you're not a superhero, why the fuck are you wearing a Superman costume?" the big man demanded belligerently. "Do you really want to know?" Jake asked with a solemn expression, his eyes locking onto the giant's. I couldn't help but wonder what was going on in his mind. Was he deliberately trying to provoke this man? I was horrified and braced for the worst. "I wouldn't ask you if I didn't want to know, smartass," growled the big guy, crossing his arms and glaring at Jake. Jake leaned in closer to the man and spoke softly. "My wife cheated on me with another man. She left me, broke my heart, and humiliated me. I put on this suit to protect myself because I don't want to be hurt like that again." The big guy stared at Jake for what felt like an eternity, and then something unexpected happened. He wrapped his massive arms around Jake and hugged him. "Damn, man, I know how you feel. My wife did the same thing to me." He let go of Jake, patted him on the shoulder, and said, "Take care of yourself, you hear?" With those words, he stepped aside, opening a clear path to the door for us. Behind us, someone shouted, "Good night, Superman," and others joined in the chorus as we exited the building. Out on the sidewalk, I started to shake uncontrollably. "Oh my God, Jake, I thought he was going to kill you," I said, my voice quivering with the remnants of fear. Jake looked at me with a triumphant glint in his eye. "I thought so too," he admitted. Then his smile returned, and he added, "Let's go get something to eat." He led me to a nearby late-night diner, and after we ordered, I couldn't contain my curiosity. "What made you say that to that guy?" I asked. "How did you know he would react like that?" Jake shook his head. "I had no idea what he was going to do. I just figured that Superman wouldn't try to wriggle out of the situation, but would tell the truth and see what came of it." "Yeah," I said, "but Superman couldn't get hurt. That guy could have blown your head off." Jake smiled sadly. "You're probably right, but I was already in so much pain that I thought, who cares what happens next?" I took a bite of my sandwich, buying myself some time to process what he'd just said. It was becoming clear to me how deeply wounded this man was, and how much he relied on the symbolic protection of his suit. I decided to steer the conversation in a lighter direction. "I was impressed with how easily you got all those people talking," I said. "You should run for political office." "No," he answered immediately. "I'm not interested. I'm just learning to enjoy talking to people." I shook my head in disbelief. "How many of those people at the bar did you know?" I asked curiously. He smiled. "None of them. The only one I recognized was the bartender." I found that hard to believe. "How did you learn to make conversation with strangers so easily?" I asked. He shook his head and laughed softly. "That's funny, Kaylee. All my life I've been shy around people. Back in high school, I stuck to crowds because I didn't feel confident alone, but I guess the Superman suit gives me a sort of alter ego. When I put it on, I feel like I can do things that the real Jake never could." I pondered his words, realizing the profound effect this simple costume had on him. "So, it's like the suit transforms you," I mused. "Exactly," he said. "It's not just a costume. It's a way for me to step outside my comfort zone and be someone who isn't afraid to engage with the world. And in doing that, I've learned that people are more receptive than I ever imagined." As the night wore on, I saw Jake in a new light. He wasn't just a man in a costume. He was someone who had found a unique way to heal and grow, and I couldn't help but admire him for that. "In a group, I could just react to what everyone else was saying," Jake explained, the smile fading from his face. "But after Glenda left, things got a lot worse. I didn't want to see anyone or be with anyone. I just wanted to dig a hole and crawl into it. But after I started wearing the Superman costume, it became much easier for me to go out on my own, meet new people, and talk to them. I just thought about how Superman handled situations and tried to act the same way." The image of a shy and indecisive Jake didn't fit with the extroverted man I had observed earlier, so I pressed the subject. Maybe the suit helped you come out of your shell, I said, but that doesn't explain how you learned to talk to people so effortlessly. It's not a big deal, he said. I really like people. I just never felt comfortable around them. Now I do, and I want to know what they think and how they feel. When I feel good, I want others to feel good too. I didn't say anything back, but all I could think was, there's a lot more to this guy than I thought. At that moment, a woman walked into the diner, making me think of my earlier encounter with the predatory blonde. I asked Jake about the incident. Do things like that happen often? I inquired. He was visibly embarrassed. Yes, he admitted. It's happened a few times. Did you ever go home with any of them? I asked before I could stop myself. What was I thinking, asking a question like that? But before I could backtrack, he was already answering. It was the first time I'd been with a woman since Glenda left, and I guess I really wanted to. He laughed lightly. After that, she accused me of being faster than a speeding bullet. But then it got better, he continued ingenuously. I just kept reminding myself that Superman could control himself, and the girls started liking me more. But pretty soon, I got to the point where getting laid didn't seem so appealing anymore. He looked at me with pain in his eyes. I guess I'm old-fashioned. All I wanted was one woman, if she was the right one. I thought Glenda was like that, but it turned out to be different. He glanced suddenly at the clock above the counter. Do you need to go home? He asked thoughtfully. Looking at the time, I was shocked at how late it was already. He walked me to the curb and caught a cab for me. I guess a cape fluttering in the wind comes in handy sometimes. While the cabbie eyed him curiously, Jake opened the door and helped me inside. Thanks, Kaylee, he said. I know it was just for your article, but I really enjoyed being with you tonight. Then he closed the door, and as the cab pulled away, I looked back and saw him standing on the curb. The cabbie turned to look at me. Who was that? He asked curiously. I'm still not sure I know, I replied. When I got home, Ruby was waiting for me, and she wanted to know all about my evening. After I finished recounting the night's adventures, she asked what I thought of Jake. When I told her about how badly he'd been hurt, she gave me a hard look. He may have had a hard time because of his ex-wife, but he's not a lost kitten, Kaylee. You don't need to give him shelter and a bowl of milk, you know. I know, I said, but it was hard for me to stop thinking about him and everything he'd been through. When I sat down to write the article about Jake, I found it very difficult to get started. On the one hand, recounting the experiences Jake shared with me would be easy, and what I observed in the park and at the bar would definitely make a great piece. But I struggled to convey what was really going on inside Jake. One question every reader would want an answer to is why a seemingly normal guy would do such a seemingly irrational act. I reread the article several times before I came up with a headline I liked. Heartbroken superhero seemed to best capture the paradox, and once I realized that, the rest flowed easily. When I got the assignment, I was sure it would be a waste of time and my work would be ruined. But after a tumultuous day and night with Jake, and another day spent trying to describe what was really going on inside him, I began to care deeply about my piece. I didn't want it to end up in the Spike, and I was terrified when I finally turned it in to the editor. An hour later, she called me. Do you have more? She asked gruffly. What do you mean? I asked irritably. It's already the right length. I had carefully edited the article down to the standard length for the city section. Yes, it's the right length, she replied, her tone softening. But this is a hell of a story, Kaylee. I think our readers will want to know more about Jake. Can you follow up with him? Maybe dig a little deeper? A rush of relief and excitement washed over me. Of course, I said eagerly. I'll get right on it. As I hung up the phone, I couldn't help but smile. Jake had started out as just another assignment, but he had become something much more, a fascinating, complex person whose story deserved to be told in full, and I was determined to do just that. I consider myself a serious writer, and I realized that if I didn't edit my work, someone else would start editing it and ruin what I had done. It's not suitable for Sunday Magazine, she said, and I sighed. An article in Sunday Magazine can be much longer. What's more, the articles that appear there tend to get a lot of attention, and unlike the daily articles, they stay on the Times website all week long. I was shocked, pleasantly shocked, of course, but still. I went back to the computer and started pulling up all the material I had cut out. With the luxury of all those lovely extra column inches, I quickly began to revise what I had, turning it from a news item into a feature story. I kept the basic idea, but now, freed from the inverted pyramid style, allowed the story to flow much more organically. By the end of the day, I had finished the piece, and my editor was quite pleased. "It's really good, Kaylee," she told me, "and you managed to submit it in time for the Sunday edition." I felt like I'd hit a grand slam. In the evening, I did something I shouldn't have done. I called Jake and told him to check the Sunday Times magazine this weekend. "So it won't be in the daily news?" he asked, uncertainly. "Is that good or bad?" "Oh, that's definitely a good thing," I said. "You'll see." After I hung up the phone, however, I began to have my doubts. What I'd turned into the editor was a positive, honest, human interest story, and I thought it captured Jake very well. But that didn't mean the finished product would turn out that way. What if some higher-up editor decided to turn the story into a humor piece mocking Jake, or worse, making fun of him? I've seen that happen before, and the result could be pretty brutal. If it happened, he'd think I'd written it that way. The more I thought about it, the more I wished I hadn't called him. Reporters are supposed to keep their distance from their subjects, to be impartial. If they don't, they lose objectivity, and then it's no longer reporting. But damn it, I found that I couldn't help but like Jake. And if my article turned into a rant, I'd feel terrible. Besides, I admitted to myself I'd probably never see the guy again. While that was still unlikely, it would be nice to think it was possible. I had deliberately avoided perusing the magazine beforehand, but when my own copy of the Times showed up on my doorstep, I quickly reached for the magazine section. There, on the cover, a picture of Jake standing on a boulder in Central Park stared back at me with smiling eyes and a hard expression. Underneath it was the headline, "Queen's Superhero with a Broken Heart." OMG, my story made the cover. I quickly switched to the article under my author title and started reading. I was relieved to see that they hadn't turned my article into a parody. Moreover, the more I read, the more I realized that they had used it almost exactly as I had written it. Not only that, they had used all of it, my whole damn article. Wow! I sat there in my pajamas and felt great. Getting the cover story was an amazing coup that a reporter like me could only dream of. And then another thought struck me. I wanted Jake to read the article and tell me he liked it. Where did that come from? I wondered. After reading the article, Ruby only shook her head. "You're doing it again, Elle. This guy is damaged. I don't want you to get hurt." I ignored her. On Monday, I received numerous congratulatory phone calls, but I hadn't heard from Jake. I realized that he had no particular reason to call, but I grew more wary every day. Maybe he had a different reaction to the article, I thought. Or maybe he took offense at my attempts to give a balanced view of him. Or maybe, I thought sadly, he just wasn't interested in talking to me again. I was deep in self-pity when my cell phone rang. It was Jake. "Hi, Kaylee," he said. "I'm sorry I didn't call you sooner, but things have been crazy around here. None of my friends at work can believe it's me. My mom from Illinois even called. I don't know how she found out about it. She's worried about me," he said with a laugh. "She thinks I've lost my mind." He kept talking nonsense while I tried to get a word in edgewise. Finally, he paused to catch his breath, and I took advantage of the moment. "So," I said, "what do you think of the article?" "Oh, that was," he said, then paused, and I heard him talking to someone else for a few seconds before he got back on the line. "Look, that was my boss, so I should get going. But before I do, I was wondering if you could have lunch with me on Wednesday. Then we can talk more about it." "Sure, I guess," I said, trying not to give away my impatience. "Great," he enthused, and gave me the name of a small establishment on 8th Avenue, not far from my office. "I'll see you Wednesday at noon," he said, and left. As I hung up, I couldn't help but feel a mix of excitement and nervousness. This story was becoming more personal than I'd ever intended, and I wasn't sure where it would lead. But one thing was certain. I was looking forward to finding out. As I hung up the phone, I wished we'd had more time to talk about the article, but it didn't sound like he was unhappy with it. At least he wanted to see me again. Turning back to the computer screen, I saw a slight smile reflected back at me. On Wednesday, I arrived at the restaurant a few minutes early, but Jake was already there, wearing his Superman costume. I wasn't expecting that. He was chatting animatedly with some man when I walked in, but when he spotted me, he shook the man's hand like they were old friends and rushed over to me. Leaning in, he kissed me on the cheek and then led me back to the table. "Who was that man?" I asked curiously. "Oh, that was the restaurant owner. When he saw me come in wearing the suit, he came over and wanted to talk to me," Jake explained nonchalantly, as if such things happened to him every day. Then his face lit up with enthusiasm. "You won't believe what's been happening to me," he said with the excitement of a little boy. "I told you about my friends at work and how surprised they were to read about me, right? Well, they adamantly demanded that I wear the suit to work on Tuesday. At first, I didn't even consider it because I really want to be taken seriously at my job, and I was afraid of what the reaction would be. But they kept insisting, and eventually, I decided, the hell with it." He paused as the waitress brought our food, then continued his story between bites. "So, when I walked in Tuesday morning, my friends went wild. Then my supervisor walked in. I was horrified, but she just stared at me for a minute. Then she snorted and said, 'Okay, I guess you can wear that thing, but if it detracts from the work environment, you're going to have to change.' I was shocked. I thought she'd be furious, but her reaction boosted my confidence. After lunch, I decided to take another gamble. I did something I'd wanted to do for a long time, but hadn't dared to do before I put on the suit." He leaned closer, and his enthusiasm was palpable. Every week, publishers receive dozens of unsolicited manuscripts from aspiring writers. They usually get tossed in the garbage or sent an automated "thank you, but no thank you" letter, he explained. But I started looking through some of them to see what they were about and found one that seemed really good. Beginning authors are usually terrible, with bad grammar and trite or ridiculous plots. But this book was so much better, and I really thought it had potential. He flashed his wide grin at me. Anyway, on Tuesday, I decided to act more like Superman than myself. I took the manuscript to Mrs. Grissom, my boss. Normally, junior editors don't do that, but I figured, why not take a chance? "And," I prompted, eager to hear the outcome. "And she loved it," he exclaimed. She was so impressed that she called the author right away and set up a meeting. Now the manuscript is in the process of being reviewed for publication. I can't believe it. If this works out, it could be a huge break for me. I couldn't help but share in his excitement. "That's amazing, Jake. I'm so happy for you. It sounds like wearing the suit has really changed things for you." "It has," he said earnestly. "It gave me the confidence to take risks and believe in myself. I never would have had the courage to do any of this before." As we continued our meal, Jake's excitement was contagious, and I found myself inspired by his story. Here was a man who had turned a personal tragedy into a catalyst for positive change. It was a powerful reminder of the resilience of the human spirit. By the time we finished lunch, I felt a renewed sense of purpose in my own life. Jake had shown me that sometimes taking a leap of faith and embracing the unknown could lead to incredible opportunities. As we said our goodbyes, I couldn't help but think that this was just the beginning of a remarkable journey for both of us. After lunch, I went to Mrs. Grissom's office and handed her the manuscript. When she told me to stop wasting her time, I took a deep breath and said, "Mrs. Grissom, please take this home and read the first couple of chapters. If I've really wasted your time, then you should fire me because I clearly don't have the right talent for the job." I tried not to show my reaction, but my insides clenched. What Jake was describing was something I often dreamed of because I always wanted to become a serious writer. I'd even written a novel, but I'd never tried to submit it anywhere because I knew it wasn't good enough. To hide my envy, I said, "You didn't really do it, did you, Jake? I know how much you love your job. You take a lot of risks." He grinned crookedly. "Maybe so, but I really believe in it, and I figured it was better to take the risk than to live in constant fear of failure." "So what happened? I wanted to know." "Nothing yet," he said. "Mrs. Grissom is out of town and won't be back until Friday." "Oh my God," I said. "I'm going to be nervous waiting to see what she thinks." That's why I wanted to have lunch with you today, so I could have something more pleasant on my mind. I blushed in spite of myself. I knew it was just flattery, but it still felt good. And then he said something that made me feel even better. There's another reason I wanted to see you today. One of the big online booksellers is throwing a swanky cocktail party for the publishing industry this Saturday. We should all go, and I'd really like you to come with me. You want me to be your date? I asked, surprised. Yes, if you're not in a relationship and you want to come. No, I'm not in a relationship, I stammered. Yeah, I'd love to go with you. Great, he said, and handed me a copy of the invitation. Here are all the details. Why don't I meet you in the lobby at 8 o'clock? I nodded because I seemed to be having trouble speaking. To hide my awkwardness, I glanced at my watch. Oh, wow, I have to get back to work. Jake nodded and started craning his neck to look for the waitress who was supposed to bring our check. But instead, the owner spotted him and approached our table. It's not often we get a superhero for lunch, he smiled. Your lunch is on the house. Jake stood up and thanked him warmly. Then they hugged, as is customary for men, and we headed for the door. As we stepped outside, the sunlight hit Jake's costume, making the colors even more vibrant. I couldn't help but feel a surge of excitement about the upcoming weekend. See you on Saturday, Jake said with a wink before he turned and walked down the street, his cape fluttering behind him. All the way back to my office, I couldn't stop thinking about the invitation. A swanky cocktail party with Jake sounded like a dream, and I found myself daydreaming about the possibilities. When I arrived at my desk, I immediately dove into my work, trying to focus and push the excitement to the back of my mind. But it was no use. Every now and then, my thoughts drifted back to Jake and our upcoming date. By the end of the day, I had replayed our conversation a dozen times in my head, each time feeling a bit more giddy. As I packed up to leave, I glanced at the invitation once more, my heart fluttering with anticipation. This weekend was going to be something special, and I could hardly wait to see how it would unfold. I guess that's what happens when you're around a celebrity, and I had to remind myself that I was at least partially responsible for his fame. At that moment, 3 people about our age ran up to us and started chatting animatedly with Jake, teasing him about what had happened at work. I held back so he could talk to his friends, but he wrapped his arms around my waist and pulled me gently to him. Hello, everyone, he said with a warm smile. This is Kaylee Finn, my traveling companion. She is also the reporter who wrote the Times article. He turned to me, introducing his colleagues one by one. Kaylee, these are the people I told you about from my office, Jacob, Tommy, and Marie. When I shook hands with the 2 guys, I noticed that they both took the opportunity to check me out, which, I'll admit, pleased me. But when I shook Marie's hand, I thought I saw a hint of jealousy in her eyes. She was probably hoping Jake would ask her to go with him, I thought, feeling a slight smugness at the fact that I was the one in his arms. After a few more minutes of lighthearted conversation, the 3 of them retreated to the appetizer table to refresh their plates, and I took the opportunity to pull Jake aside. So, what was that about something big happening in your office? I asked, curiosity piqued. Gosh, I almost forgot to tell you the big news, Jake said, his eyes lighting up. Mrs. Grissom called me into her office today, and I was sure she was going to give me the axe. But instead, she said she liked the manuscript I gave her. She thinks it has great potential. That's amazing, Jake, I said excitedly. I can't believe it. Your gamble paid off. And that's not all, he continued, unable to contain his excitement. She told me she really admired my initiative and willingness to take risks. She said that was exactly the kind of senior editor they needed. So, instead of being fired, I got a promotion and a big raise. Oh, Jake, congratulations, I exclaimed and hugged him tightly. He responded to my hug, and it felt really good until I suddenly felt him tense up. What's wrong? I asked, pulling back slightly to look at his face. That's Glenda, my ex, he said in a low voice. She's coming this way, and that's Connor James with her. He's the guy she cheated with. Why are they here? I asked, my curiosity turning to concern. I should have known she'd be here, he replied, his tone heavy with resignation. Her firm does a lot of legal work with the publishing business. I turned and saw a pretty blonde in an evening dress, accompanied by a man in a tuxedo. Her frowning face gave the impression that she had eaten something sour. She didn't wait for us to approach and spoke in an angry voice. "I can't believe you showed up to an event like this in that stupid Halloween costume, Jake. You're making a complete fool of yourself." Jake folded his arms across his chest, and I noticed the tension in his posture. "Why are you so upset, Glenda? Why do you care what I choose to wear?" "Because it's embarrassing," she snapped. "People are talking, and not in a good way." "Well, Glenda, I stopped caring about what you think a long time ago," Jake said firmly, his voice steady. "I'm here to enjoy myself and celebrate with my friends." Glenda's face twisted with anger, but Connor placed a hand on her arm, trying to calm her down. "Come on, Glenda, let's not cause a scene," he said, shooting a wary glance at the people around us who had begun to take notice. "Fine," she huffed, turning on her heel and stalking off, dragging Connor with her. I looked up at Jake, impressed by how he had handled the confrontation. "Are you okay?" I asked softly. He took a deep breath and nodded. "Yeah, I'm fine. It's just, I wasn't expecting to see her here tonight." I squeezed his hand reassuringly. "You handled that really well." He smiled down at me, a mixture of gratitude and relief in his eyes. "Thanks, Kaylee. Let's not let her ruin our night." We rejoined the party, and I couldn't help but feel a renewed sense of admiration for Jake. Despite everything he had been through, he had managed to remain strong and true to himself. The rest of the evening flew by in a blur of laughter and conversation, and as the night drew to a close, I realized that I had never felt more connected to someone. As we left the Waldorf Astoria, Jake wrapped his arm around my shoulders, pulling me close. "Thanks for being here with me tonight," he said softly. "Anytime," I replied, leaning into him. "I'm glad I could share it with you." As we walked down the city streets, the night air cool against our skin, I couldn't help but feel that this was the start of something truly special. "You look ridiculous in that padded suit, and I'm embarrassed to have you here like this, amongst all these important people," Glenda spat out, her eyes blazing with disdain. "Sorry to embarrass you, but I'm going to wear what I want whether you like it or not," Jake responded coolly, then added, "And for your information, the suit has no lining." Reflexively, Glenda reached out and touched his bicep, then jerked her hand away in embarrassment when she realized what she'd done. Clearly trying to change the subject, she glanced at me with a smirk. "You have not introduced me to your little companion for this evening," she said wryly. "I beg your pardon," he said in a sarcastic tone. "Glenda Preston, let me introduce you to Kaylee Finn. This is the New York Times reporter who wrote the Sunday magazine article about me." She looked at me with a chuckle. "How appropriate," she said. "An associate editor at a publishing house and a reporter at a newspaper, two losers from two dying industries." Then, before either of us could react, she grabbed her companion's arm and said loudly, "Come on, Connor, let's get out of here." Jake started to stalk after her, but I grabbed his arm. "Please don't make a scene, Jake," I begged. "Who cares what she thinks?" For a second, I thought he was going to pull away from me and go after her, but then his muscles relaxed. "Okay, Kaylee, I'll leave it at that. She just has a way of getting to me. I've barely seen or talked to her since she left, and I thought she couldn't upset me anymore. And here, in less than 2 minutes, she's insulting me and you, and there's nothing I can do about it." I didn't want to ask, but I couldn't resist voicing my concerns. "Do you still have feelings for her, Jake?" I asked, my voice soft with apprehension. He looked genuinely flabbergasted. "Oh God, no. It's not that at all. I guess what makes me so upset is that she's the one who messed up. She's the one who lied and left me, and I'm the one who feels bad. And then, all of a sudden, she shows up tonight and acts like it's all my fault. And there's nothing I can do about it." It was clear that he was still hurt by what had happened, but I was relieved that he wasn't fixated on Glenda. I tried to divert his attention by talking about his work and my own. We stayed and chatted. I drank champagne, he drank sparkling water, and the two of us ate so many appetizers it would have been enough for an entire meal. We even went out on the dance floor and did a little dance, and we were both starting to feel better. The music was lively, and the lights were low, creating an ambiance that made it easy to forget about everything else. As we moved to the rhythm, I could see the tension melting away from Jake's face, replaced by a genuine smile. You're a pretty good dancer, Jake, I said, trying to keep the mood light. Thanks, Kaylee, he replied, twirling me around. You're not too bad yourself. We danced for a while longer, lost in the moment. The worries and stresses of the evening seemed to fade into the background. Eventually, we found ourselves back at the bar, laughing and talking like old friends. You know, Kaylee, this turned out to be a pretty great night, Jake said, raising his glass of sparkling water in a toast. I agree, I said, clinking my champagne glass against his. To unexpected surprises. To unexpected surprises, he echoed, his eyes twinkling. As the night drew to a close, we left the Waldorf Astoria with lighter hearts. Jake walked me to a cab, and as he opened the door for me, he leaned in and kissed me on the cheek. Thanks for everything tonight, Kaylee, he said softly. I really needed this. Anytime, Jake, I replied, my heart fluttering. I'm glad we could share it together. As the cab pulled away, I looked back and saw him standing on the curb, his Superman cape fluttering in the night breeze. I couldn't help but smile, knowing that this was just the beginning of something special. Finally, Jake leaned over to me and whispered, I'm ready to go if you are. When I nodded, he walked me down the stairs and we got into a waiting cab. I can afford that more often now, he said with a slight smile, hinting at his recent promotion and raise. As we drove to my apartment, I thought about what had happened tonight. I liked Jake a lot, and I admired him in many ways. At the same time, I realized that he was still deeply hurt by what Glenda had done to him. He had told me this before, but tonight I had experienced firsthand that she still had a powerful hold over him. What a bitch, I thought angrily, regretting that I couldn't do anything to help. I was beginning to feel very protective of this contradictory man who was both strong and vulnerable. Perhaps it was because of this, or maybe just because a little of the courage from his Superman suit had transferred to me as well, but I felt a growing determination to be there for him. When we reached my place, I turned to him and asked, Would you like to come upstairs for a bit? His eyes lit up, and he replied, Yes, I really do. Unlocking the door to my darkened apartment, I whispered, My neighbor is probably asleep by now, so we'll have to be quiet. But when I reached for the light switch, his big hand gently covered mine to stop me. Then, with a strength that took me by surprise, he lifted me up in his arms as if I weighed nothing. Which one is your bedroom? He asked softly, and all I could do was point. Truth be told, this was exactly what I'd hoped for when I'd invited him in, but I hadn't expected him to read my mind so well and take charge so completely. Now, I was glad he had. When I woke up in the morning, I reached for him, but his side of the bed was empty. A pang of disappointment hit me, thinking he had snuck out. However, before I could feel sorry for myself, he reappeared in the doorway, and I realized he must have just needed to use the bathroom. I felt relieved and happy when he crawled back under the sheets beside me, his presence warm and reassuring. We had a fantastic night. After a while, I got up and took a quick shower before making coffee and starting breakfast. I heard the shower running again and figured he was awake too. Sure enough, he soon emerged, smiling gratefully at me when he smelled the food. I had just set the table for him when my neighbor's door opened and she appeared in her robe and slippers. Jake, I said, this is my neighbor, Ruby Feldman. Ruby, this is Jake Stevenson. They shook hands, and after pouring herself a cup of coffee, she sat down and stared at Jake so intently that he couldn't help but notice. I guess you're not used to seeing someone in a Superman costume, he said good-naturedly. No, she said with a grin, I'm not used to seeing my neighbor bring home a man. Jake chuckled, and I blushed with embarrassment. Sunday was rainy, and since Ruby had to go out, I asked Jake if he could stay for a while. He agreed, and we spent the morning sitting on the couch, reading the Sunday paper together. The atmosphere was cozy, and I was beginning to feel warm and at home with him. As the rain pattered against the windows, I looked at Jake, who was engrossed in an article. I realized that, despite everything, this man had brought something special into my life. Perhaps, just perhaps, this was the start of something wonderful. There were alarm bells going off in my head, but I didn't pay attention to them because I was feeling so good. After a while, Jake put the paper aside and turned to me. So what's the deal with your roommate? He asked. She seems a lot older than you. Are you related? No, I laughed. Although sometimes she acts like my mother. She sort of adopted me at work, and when my ex-boyfriend kicked me out of his apartment, she offered to let me move in with her. Ruby's been looking after me ever since." He nodded thoughtfully. After a couple more minutes, he spoke again. "I just realized you already know everything about me," he said. "How about you let me hear your story?" I poured myself another cup of coffee and began. Not much to tell. Growing up, I was something of a tomboy. Besides the fact that I wasn't attracted to typical girly things, I started getting chubby late, so the boys in high school paid little attention to me. But that didn't bother me much because I got into writing. Instead of socializing, I worked on the school newspaper and yearbook. By the time I got to college, I had a figure and some male students started hitting on me. But I was pretty shy due to my lack of experience, and most guys weren't patient enough to wait for me to get comfortable with them. Once again, I started spending most of my free time writing. In addition to the college paper, I tried to write the great American novel. Unsuccessfully, it must be said. Although I didn't date much, I did have one pretty intense romance, but the guy broke my heart my senior year when he dumped me for someone else. When I graduated from college, I managed to get a job at my hometown newspaper. While I was working there, I did some reporting that earned me a good reputation. When I applied for a job at the Times, they apparently liked what I did because I got the job. When my then boyfriend dumped me, Ruby took me under her wing, and that's pretty much my whole story. Jake and I spent all day at my apartment and ended up making love again. It was no worse than the first time. Eventually, he said he had to go home to get ready for work on Monday. As he left, he kissed me and said, "I'll call you." I hoped he meant it, but that's what my last beau said, and I never heard from him again. I really hoped Jake was sincere, especially since in many ways this was the best weekend of my life. I wasn't ready for it to be over. Ruby got home a little later and gave me a careful look. "So, how was it?" she asked, her voice tinged with curiosity. I couldn't help but smile. "It was amazing, Ruby. He's different, in a good way." She nodded, but I could see the concern in her eyes. "Just be careful, okay? I don't want to see you get hurt again." "I know," I said, "but I think this time it's different." The next few days passed in a blur of work and daydreams about Jake. He called me on Tuesday, just as he had promised, and we talked for over an hour. By the time Friday rolled around, I was practically floating on air. Saturday night finally arrived, and I dressed up again, this time feeling a little more confident. When Jake showed up at my door, he was wearing the Superman suit again, but this time it didn't surprise me. It just felt right. We headed out to a cozy little restaurant that Jake had picked. It was the perfect place for a date, intimate and warm, with just the right amount of background noise to make our conversation private. Over dinner, we talked about everything, our dreams, our fears, and our plans for the future. I felt a connection with Jake that I hadn't felt with anyone else in a long time. After dinner, we took a walk along the river, the city lights reflecting off the water. It was a magical night, and by the time we got back to my apartment, I knew that I was falling for him. When we finally said goodnight, Jake kissed me softly. "I had a great time tonight, Kaylee," he said. "I really like you." "I like you too, Jake," I replied, my heart racing. As I watched him walk away, I couldn't help but feel hopeful about the future. Maybe, just maybe, this time things would work out. The weekend had been perfect, and as I fell asleep that night, I couldn't help but smile. For the first time in a long time, I felt like everything was going to be okay. Well, I'll tell you what, he's definitely getting attention. When I didn't say anything, she gave me a hard look. "You really have it bad, don't you? I've never seen you treat a guy like that." "He's really special," I admitted, "but I still have a lot of doubts. It's so strange. I'm happier than ever, but at the same time, I'm scared to death." She only shook her head. "If he hurts you, I'll make a contract with him." I knew she was joking, but I really appreciated her concern. She walked down the hall, but then turned around. "Oh, and next time, don't forget to use an air freshener. It stinks in here." I turned crimson. Monday night when I got home, no sooner had I closed the door than the phone rang. It was Jake, and he was so excited I could barely understand him. "Elle, you won't believe what happened tonight. The CBS people called. I'm going to be on the Letterman show tomorrow night." He revealed that he has been a huge fan of David's for years, and couldn't believe he would be a guest on his idol's show. "Is your participation in the Letterman show going to be a problem for Mrs. Grissom?" I asked. But Jake assured me that there would be no problem with the publisher. "It's great publicity for them," he enthused. I promised him I would watch, as if I could do anything else. But after I hung up the phone, I was overcome with mixed feelings. On the one hand, I was so happy about Jake's unexpected good fortune and so glad that he had decided to call me to share the news. On the other hand, a nagging voice was asking if I liked the real Jake or just the man in the suit. Now that I thought about it, I realized that I had never seen him without a suit, except when we went to bed together. Then I suddenly began to wonder if the suit was a crutch he needed to get through life. I tried to brush off my doubts, but they wouldn't go away so easily. It's so like me to worry about good news. Needless to say, on Tuesday night, Ruby and I settled in front of the TV just in time for the Letterman show to start. David's first guest was a pretty young pop singer in a very short skirt who performed her latest hit and then sat down on the couch to chat with the host for a bit. Then, after a commercial break, David introduced the man everyone in New York City is talking about, the city's latest hero, Superman. The audience applauded as Jake came on stage, waved to the crowd, and then shook hands with David and the pop star. I held my breath, hoping Jake wouldn't do anything that would seem funny, but I needn't have worried. Despite his adoration for Letterman, Jake appeared relaxed and at ease with the conversation. He told the story of why he started wearing the suit, how it gave him confidence, and how it allowed him to connect with people in a way he never could before. David was genuinely interested, and Jake's sincerity and charm won over not only the host, but the audience as well. He shared anecdotes about his interactions with people while wearing the suit, making everyone laugh with his self-deprecating humor. Then David asked, "So Superman, is there a Lois Lane in your life?" Jake hesitated for a moment, and my heart skipped a beat. "Well," he said, looking straight into the camera, "there might be someone special, someone who's been there for me, even when I wasn't sure of myself." I blushed, realizing he was talking about me. Ruby, sitting next to me, nudged me with a grin. "Sounds like he's talking about you, Elle." The interview wrapped up with David inviting Jake to come back anytime, and as the show went to a commercial break, Jake waved to the audience one last time before exiting the stage. I felt a mix of pride and affection for him, knowing that he had handled himself so well. After the show, my phone buzzed with messages from friends and colleagues who had seen the interview. I replied to a few, but my mind was on Jake. Would he call me after such an exciting night? I didn't have to wait long. My phone rang, and it was him. "Did you watch it?" he asked, his voice bubbling with excitement. "Of course I did," I replied. "You were amazing, Jake. I'm so proud of you." "Thanks, Elle. It meant a lot to me that you watched." We talked for a while longer, and as we said goodnight, I felt a warm glow inside. Maybe this was the start of something real, something lasting. I knew it wouldn't be easy, and there were still doubts and fears, but for the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful. As I lay in bed that night, I replayed the evening's events in my mind. Jake on Letterman, his confident smile, his genuine charm, and then his words, "someone special." I drifted off to sleep with a smile on my face, dreaming of what the future might hold, and then proceeded to tell the story of his run-in with a biker in a bar. This story drew an approving response from the audience. Responding to a few leading questions from David, Jake deftly gave self-deprecating answers that drew laughter and applause. It was obvious that even Letterman was impressed. The pop star, on the other hand, couldn't resist stroking Jake's biceps and making suggestive comments about him being a man of steel. "Show us your superpower," she persisted, even when Jake initially refused. But after she pleaded a third time, he winked at Letterman, then stood up, bent over, and grabbed the squealing girl under her arms, easily spinning her in a large circle while revealing that she was wearing a thong. When he deftly sat her back down on the couch, she exclaimed, "Oh my God, that was amazing!" The audience erupted in laughter and applause. Letterman, who never missed a cue, shouted out, "Ladies and gentlemen, Superman." The applause turned into a standing ovation. Jake turned and bowed to the singer, shook Letterman's hand again, and left the stage, waving to the audience who continued to applaud. Ruby turned to me in amazement. That's quite a performance. Are you sure he's never been on TV before? I don't think so, I said, but I was also shocked at how successful Jake's appearance had been. I was beginning to be convinced that the costume really was magic. The next day at work, I checked some of the night critics' blogs and saw that Jake's performance had generated a ton of approving comments. I tried to call him to congratulate him, but the line was busy every time, so I left him a voicemail. He didn't call back until the afternoon. "I'm sorry I didn't call you back sooner, Elle," he said, "but my phone has been ringing off the hook all day. And listen, I got a call from the William Morris Agency. They want to represent me. They think I have show business potential." "Really? That's incredible, Jake," I said. "What did you tell them?" "Well, I told them I wanted to think about it. It would mean I'd have to quit my job here. But the guy said he thought they could get me on a lot of shows and appearances, and that could bring in a lot of money. He even hinted that they could make a deal with Hollywood to make a movie." The whining voice I'd heard before was now screaming at me, but I tried to keep my fears out of my voice. "Oh, Jake, I'm so happy for you. Everything seems to be working out just fine." "I know," he said, "but I don't want to rush into it and make a decision I'll regret later. I really love my job, and I don't know if I'm ready to leave it for something so uncertain." "That's smart," I replied. "It's good to take your time and think things through. You have a lot of potential, and you should make sure it's the right move for you." "Thanks, Elle. Your support means a lot to me," he said warmly. After we hung up, I couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions. I was genuinely happy for Jake, but I also feared what this new development might mean for us. Would he still have time for me if he became a big star? Would he change and become someone I didn't recognize? That evening, Ruby noticed my pensive mood. "What's on your mind, Elle?" she asked. I sighed. "It's Jake. He got an offer from the William Morris Agency, and they're talking about show business and movies. I'm thrilled for him, but I'm also scared. What if he becomes famous and forgets about me?" Ruby gave me a reassuring smile. "Elle, if Jake is the guy you think he is, he'll find a way to make it work. And if he doesn't, then maybe he wasn't the right guy after all. But you can't live in fear of what might happen. Enjoy the moment and see where it leads." Her words gave me some comfort, but the uncertainty still lingered in the back of my mind. I decided to take it one day at a time and see how things unfolded. The rest of the week flew by, and before I knew it, it was Saturday night, the night of the big cocktail party. I dressed in my best little black dress and black ankle-strap heels, trying to keep my nerves in check. When I arrived at the Waldorf Astoria, I spotted Jake immediately, looking dashing in his Superman costume. He rushed over to me, his face lighting up with a smile. "You look amazing, Elle," he said, taking my hand. "Thank you, Jake. You look pretty incredible yourself," I replied, feeling my heart flutter. The evening was a whirlwind of introductions, conversations, and laughter. Jake was the center of attention, but he made sure to include me in every conversation. I watched as he navigated the room with ease, charming everyone he met. It was clear that he was in his element, and I couldn't help but feel proud of him. At one point, he pulled me aside and whispered, "Thank you for being here with me tonight. I couldn't have done this without you." His words filled me with warmth, and I squeezed his hand in response. "I'm happy to be here, Jake. You deserve all of this and more." As the night drew to a close, we found ourselves alone on the terrace, looking out over the city lights. Jake turned to me, his expression serious. "Elle, there's something I need to tell you." My heart skipped a beat. "What is it, Jake?" He took a deep breath. "I think I'm falling in love with you." His words took my breath away. "Jake," before I could finish, he leaned in and kissed me, a tender, lingering kiss that sent shivers down my spine. When he finally pulled back, he looked into my eyes and smiled. "I just wanted you to know how I feel." I smiled back, my heart swelling with happiness. "I think I'm falling in love with you too, Jake." As we stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, I knew that whatever the future held, we would face it together. And for the first time in a long time, I felt truly hopeful and excited about what was to come. He grinned crookedly. "I already did that once with Glenda. I offered to help him in any way I could, but then he got a phone call and had to disconnect." I'll talk to you tomorrow, he promised. When I got home that evening, I felt strangely depressed. I had rejoiced at Jake's success, but all I could see was him wearing that Superman suit for years to come. What kind of future could he and I have if he went on talk shows or worse, Hollywood? I felt like he cared about me, but I could see that I was becoming nothing more than a footnote in his story. The hopeful side of me kept begging me not to get ahead of myself, but the pessimist in me was saying that trouble was already here and looming on my doorstep. Writing is one way to relax, but that night I couldn't find the energy to do even that. Ruby poked her head through the door and demanded to know what was bothering me, so I tearfully told her my fears. As far as I'm concerned, Ruby said, the real problem is this Glenda woman. She's his kryptonite. He can't stop wearing the suit because she's still capable of doing him harm. Do you want me to put a contract on her? I laughed and escorted her out of my room. 2 days later, I was working on a routine task in my office when a coworker walked up to me and caught my eye. Hey, Elle, aren't you the one dating Superman? When I blushed and admitted that we had met, he pointed to my computer and said, Look in Gawker today. There's an article that mentions him. When I first looked at the news and gossip blog, I didn't see the story because I was looking for Jake's picture, but upon looking again, I found it. Under the headline, Woman Who Broke Superman's Heart, was a picture of a woman angrily pacing the street trying to fight off the camera. I suddenly realized it was Glenda Preston, Jake's ex-wife. According to the reporter, who clearly sympathized with Jake, everyone in New York is asking who hurt Superman so badly. She then revealed in an exclusive Gawker piece the whole story of Glenda cheating on Jake with attorney Connor James for months before finally dumping Jake. There were enough juicy details to realize that someone in the know had ratted Glenda out. I immediately tried to call Jake, but again, I couldn't get through. He didn't call me that night either, which made me even more wary, and I decided not to bother him. Maybe it was just my imagination, but I could feel the distance between us growing, and the courage I was beginning to feel when I was with him seemed to be dissipating. One of the things we do regularly at the paper is check out what our competitors are publishing. I was in the midst of browsing through some articles when my phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Jake. Can we meet for dinner tonight? There's something important I need to talk to you about. My heart skipped a beat. I quickly texted back, sure, where and when? He replied with the name of a small, quiet restaurant downtown and suggested 7 p.m. The rest of the day dragged as I anxiously awaited our dinner. When I arrived at the restaurant, Jake was already there, seated at a corner table. He stood up as I approached and gave me a warm hug. Thanks for coming, Elle, he said, his voice tinged with a seriousness that made my nerves spike. We ordered our meals, and as we waited, Jake began to speak. I saw the article on Gawker, he said, not meeting my eyes. It was like a punch to the gut. I thought I was past all that, but seeing it all laid out like that brought everything back. I'm so sorry, Jake, I said softly. I tried to call you when I saw it, but I couldn't get through. He nodded. I know, I was swamped with calls and messages. It's been overwhelming, but that's not what I wanted to talk to you about. He paused, taking a deep breath. I've been doing a lot of thinking about the agency offer, about everything that's been happening. And I've realized that as much as I love my job and the stability it brings, I can't keep living in fear of what might happen if I take a risk. The suit gave me the courage to step out of my comfort zone, but now I need to find that courage within myself. I looked at him, my heart pounding. What are you saying, Jake? He reached across the table and took my hand. I'm saying that I want to give it a shot. The agency, the appearances, everything. I don't want to look back and wonder, what if? But I also want you to be a part of this journey with me. I don't want you to be just a footnote in my story. I want you to be my partner. Tears welled up in my eyes. Jake, I want that too, but it's going to be hard. There's going to be a lot of challenges. He squeezed my hand. I know, but I believe we can face them together. I want to build a future with you, not just for the suit, but for who I am underneath it. Our food arrived and we ate, talking about the future and the possibilities that lay ahead. As the evening drew to a close, I felt a renewed sense of hope and determination. Whatever challenges came our way, I knew that as long as we faced them together, we could overcome anything. And as we walked out of the restaurant hand in hand, I felt like we were stepping into a new chapter of our story, one filled with promise and adventure. Of course, we at the Times don't recognize that we have competitors, but we still check other news outlets just in case. To make matters worse, on this day I was checking the Daily News, which the folks at the Times don't even recognize as a legitimate newspaper. However, as I was browsing through the New York section, an article titled "Ex-Superman Got the Axe" caught my eye. Of course, the article breathlessly recounted how Glenda Preston had been relieved of her duties at the law firm Dennison and Lawser, and that Connor James, whom the article dubbed her paramour, had also left under the radar. A senior partner at Dennison and Lawser said their behavior during office hours dishonored the firm's good name, as if a law firm has a good name. But I remembered how she had behaved to me at the cocktail party and was glad that there was some justice in the world after all. This time, when I called Jake, I was surprised to get through to him. When I started to tell him about the Daily News article, he interrupted me. "Oh yeah," he said. "I heard every word because Glenda called and told me about it herself. She grilled me from head to toe, accusing me of planting the story. Even when I pointed out details I couldn't possibly know, she still refused to believe I wasn't behind it." "So what do you think about it?" I asked. "I think I'm still digesting it all," he said. "It all happened so fast, and I don't know what to make of it." He paused as if trying to make a decision. Finally, he continued, "Elle, this week has been the craziest week of my life, and I need to talk to you about something. Would you mind meeting me Saturday afternoon at the Central Park Zoo?" When I agreed, we arranged a time, and then he hung up. As I put down the phone, I felt encouraged that he wanted to talk to me about his life. But as the evening wore on, my doubts began to grow. By nightfall, I needed to discuss them with Ruby. She understood my concerns about Jake and even offered additional reasons why I should be extra cautious. "I just don't want you to get hurt," she said. "I want to know," I told her, "why he wants to meet me at the zoo. What's the big deal?" She was on top of it in a flash. "It's the kids," she said. "It's always full of kids, and I'm willing to bet he wants to run his Superman act with them. Maybe he's even got some media to film him in action." My heart clenched. Now it all made sense. This was supposed to be the opening of his new career in show business. I hoped it would work out the way he wanted, but I knew that wasn't the case for me at all. I wanted to be his girlfriend, not a prop in a Jake and Superman show. I hate to admit it, but I shed a few tears that night after I went to bed. I almost didn't go the next day, but Ruby insisted. "Look, at least he had the decency to tell you everything to your face. Do him the courtesy of listening to his story, even though it may not be the one you want to hear. Who knows, it might be something else entirely." So, with a mixture of hope and dread, I arrived at the Central Park Zoo on Saturday afternoon. The place was bustling with families, and as I made my way through the entrance, I spotted Jake near the sea lion exhibit, surrounded by a small crowd of children. He was, of course, in his Superman suit, and the kids were laughing and clapping as he pretended to catch a make-believe villain. When he saw me, he waved and walked over, a genuine smile on his face. "Hey, Elle," he said warmly. "Thanks for coming." "Hi, Jake," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "What's going on?" He took my hand and led me to a quieter spot near the penguin exhibit. "I wanted to talk to you here because this place means a lot to me," he began. "It's where I first came when I started wearing the suit. The kids' reactions gave me a sense of purpose when I felt like I had none." I nodded, unsure of where this was going. "I know you must be wondering about all the media attention and what it means for us," he continued. "The truth is, I have been considering the agency's offer, but not because I want to be a showbiz personality. I want to use this platform to do something good, to inspire people, especially kids, to believe in themselves." I felt a glimmer of hope. "What does that mean for us, Jake?" I asked softly. He looked into my eyes, his expression sincere. "It means I want you by my side, Elle, not as a prop, but as my partner. I know this all sounds crazy, and maybe it is, but I believe we can make a difference together. I care about you, and I don't want to lose you." Tears welled up in my eyes, but this time they were tears of relief. "I care about you too, Jake," I whispered. "I was so afraid that all of this would change who you are, but hearing you say that, I believe in you." He pulled me into a hug, and I felt the weight of my worries lift. As we stood there, surrounded by the sounds of the zoo and the laughter of children, I realized that we were about to embark on a new adventure together, one that was filled with uncertainty, but also with promise and hope. And for the first time in a long while, I felt truly happy. I knew she was right, so I tried to calm my fears and headed for the park. I took the F train at 57th and 6th Streets, then walked around the pond and down East Drive until I was at the entrance to the zoo. There was a cluster of laughing and playing children near the ticket booth, and I fully expected to see Jake entertaining them. But his red and blue suit was nowhere to be seen. After buying my ticket, I walked to the main entrance, but still couldn't spot him and found a shady spot to wait. As I sat there and thought about what had happened, I noticed a man in jeans and a t-shirt walking in my direction. When he stopped right in front of me, I was startled. "Jake?" I squeaked in surprise. "Is that you?" I didn't even recognize him. I had already thought out the whole conversation, but now that he appeared in civilian clothes, I couldn't think of what to say. As we walked towards the center of the zoo, I muttered, "I don't think I've ever seen you when you weren't in your Superman costume." "Are you disappointed?" he asked, and there was a note of concern in his voice that surprised me. "No, it's not that," I said. "It's just that I expected to see you playing with the kids and your alter ego. It's Malin. That's actually what I wanted to talk to you about," he said as we approached the sea lion pool. We stopped at the railing to watch the playful creatures swim and bark for a minute, and then he led me over to a bench. He was silent for so long that I couldn't stand it. "So what's going on, Jake?" I asked, trying not to sound too alarmed. "Why aren't you wearing a suit?" He turned to look at me, and I thought there was a flicker of apprehension in his eyes again. "You know, I started wearing the suit because of Glenda. I was devastated by her leaving and humiliated that she made me a cuckold. I know it was crazy, but the thing is, the suit seemed to help. I didn't feel so vulnerable when I wore it, and it helped me get my confidence back. I started exercising and quit drinking, and that's been good for me too. Then came all this fame, and things started happening really fast. I got promoted at work when I took the manuscript to my boss. Then I got on the Letterman show, and now I have people who want me to go to Hollywood." He reached out and took my hand. "But the best thing that's happened to me out of all of this is meeting you," he said quietly. My breath caught, and my hopes started to rise, but he shattered them with his next words. "But now I have a problem, and I'm afraid I'm going to disappoint you." "I don't understand, Jake. The thing is, I started wearing this costume to protect myself from humiliation. But now that everyone knows the real story, it was she who was humiliated. She can no longer hurt me, and now she has to suffer the consequences of her actions. As a result, I no longer feel the need to wear the suit." I was encouraged by his words, but couldn't ignore the implications. "But Jake, if you stop wearing the suit, it means you'll miss out on the opportunities the agent talked about. You could be giving up real fame and fortune." "Maybe," he said, "but it's not who I am, not who I want to be, and that scares me." He looked intently into my eyes. "Would you be disappointed if I gave it all up? Would you still be interested in me if I wasn't Superman anymore?" "Oh, Jake," I screamed and threw myself into his arms, kissing him wildly and crying at the same time. When I finally calmed down, he held me at arm's length and bestowed his gorgeous smile. "I guess that means you're okay with it." Behind us, the seals started barking and clapping, and we both had to laugh. As we walked toward the subway, I tried to tell him how happy I was about his decision and how impressed I was with all the changes that had happened to him since Glenda had left him. "Wearing the suit was a little weird," I admitted, "but it was what you needed to get to the level you're at now, and I'm okay with that." When we got to my apartment, Ruby was already waiting with her hands on her hips and a stern expression on her face. But when she saw the two of us together, she relaxed and smiled. "Looks like it went okay," she said, and walked over to me for a hug. Then she turned to Jake. "You better treat her right, Superman, or I'll be looking for you." but she said it with a satisfied smile, and Jake leaned over and hugged her and promised that she would. "Okay," Ruby said. "I have to go meet some friends, and you two look like you could use some privacy." Reaching the door, she turned around to look at me. "Don't forget," she said, "the air freshener is in the closet." With those words, she walked out, leaving me blushing. Jake came over and put his arm around my shoulders. "She really cares about you, doesn't she?" he said. "Like I said, she's more like my guardian angel than my roommate," I told him. "She can be a little annoying sometimes, but it's nice to know she's got my back." When the two young men left for Elle's bedroom, Ruby walked down the sun-drenched sidewalk until she came to a small sidewalk cafe. When she noticed her two friends waiting at a table, she waved and asked the waiter to bring her a drink. "Well," said one of the women, "don't keep us in suspense. Did it work out as you hoped?" "Yes," exulted Ruby, waving her fists triumphantly. "I finally got Jake out of his Superman costume, and it's just the two of them. They're already back at the apartment, and from the way they looked at each other, they're going to be together for a long time." The other woman shook her head admiringly. "I have to hand it to you, Ruby. You have a real flair." Ruby lowered her eyes with obvious false modesty. "Oh, it's nothing," she said. "Of course, I wasn't sure about the boy for a while. When I first saw him in that costume, I thought he was crazy, a meshugginer. But Kaylee was clearly fascinated by him, and as I learned more about him, I realized that he was a good man who had been badly hurt by the witch he married. Even though they divorced, it became clear to me that she was still a bad influence on him. I decided that if I wanted to bring Elle and him together, I had to do something to break that curse." The other friend leaned forward eagerly. "So how did you do it?" "Well," Ruby continued, "I had a little help. My sister works at the same law firm as that witch, and she gave me information about what was going on over there. All I had to do was call a blogger I know at Gawker and tell her the juiciest part. When the story broke, that was all it took to expose the ex-wife and give her what she deserved. Once that happened, Jake was freed from her curse, just as I had envisioned." "Perfect," her friend exclaimed. "You think that's good?" Ruby smugly continued. "Wait until you hear what else I've done for Kaylee." "Well," said the second woman, "come on, what have you done?" Ruby reached into her bulky purse and pulled out a stack of papers. "What is it?" the first woman asked. "It's a book contract for Kaylee," declared Ruby triumphantly. "She never believed she was good enough, but I knew better. So I took a copy of her manuscript, pretended to be her agent, and sent it to a publishing house. Of course, they offered her a contract." She winked at the other ladies. "Maybe this will turn out to be my wedding present for her." The second woman shook her head admiringly and raised her glass. "I nominate Ruby Feldman for Yenti of the Year." All three women laughed and drained their glasses. Ruby looked at her friends and smiled. "I don't know about that, but I know one thing," she said. "If you want to accomplish something, you don't need a costume or superpowers to do it. All you need is a little chutzpah. And that's the secret," she concluded, leaning back in her chair with a satisfied grin. The other women clinked their glasses together in a toast. To Ruby, the real superhero. As they laughed and chatted, the camera slowly panned out, leaving the cozy scene of friends celebrating their cleverness and success. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and watch the next video. The narrator's voice chimed in as the screen faded to black. The other woman shook her head admiringly. "I have to hand it to you, Terry. You have a real flair." Terry lowered her eyes with obvious false modesty. "Oh, it's nothing," she said. "Of course, I wasn't sure about the boy for a while. When I first saw him in that costume, I thought he was crazy, a meshugginer. But Ella was clearly fascinated by him, and as I learned more about him, I realized that he was a good man who had been badly hurt by the witch he married. Even though they divorced, it became clear to me that she was still a bad influence on him. I decided that if I wanted to bring Elle and him together, I had to do something to break that curse." The other friend leaned forward eagerly. "So how did you do it?" "Well," Terry continued, "I had a little help. My sister works at the same law firm as that witch, and she gave me information about what was going on over there. All I had to do was call a blogger I know at Gawker and tell her the juiciest part. When the story broke, That was all it took to expose the ex-wife and give her what she deserved. Once that happened, Alex was freed from her curse, just as I had envisioned. "Perfect," her friend exclaimed. "You think that's good?" Terry smugly continued. "Wait until you hear what else I've done for Ella." "Well," said the second woman, "come on, what have you done?" Terry reached into her bulky purse and pulled out a stack of papers. "What is it?" the first woman asked. "It's a book contract for Ella," declared Terry triumphantly. "She never believed she was good enough, but I knew better. So I took a copy of her manuscript, pretended to be her agent, and sent it to a publishing house. Of course, they offered her a contract." She winked at the other ladies. "Maybe this will turn out to be my wedding present for her." The second woman shook her head admiringly and raised her glass. "I nominate Terry Feldman for Yenti of the Year." All three women laughed and drained their glasses. Terry looked at her friends and smiled. "I don't know about that, but I know one thing," she said. "If you want to accomplish something, you don't need a costume or superpowers to do it. All you need is a little chutzpah." "And that's the secret," she concluded, leaning back in her chair with a satisfied grin. The other women clinked their glasses together in a toast. To Terry, the real superhero. As they laughed and chatted, the camera slowly panned out, leaving the cozy scene of friends celebrating their cleverness and success. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and watch the next video. The narrator's voice chimed in as the screen faded to black.